All right, everyone, buckle up. We're about to go deep into the world of genes and aging. Today, we're diving into some really cool research on what actually influences healthy aging and longevity.
Sounds exciting.
It is. We've got this super in-depth scientific review article from, a government health website. And then we also have some really interesting findings from the Physicians Committee, the group that focuses on those plant-based diets.
Oh, cool. So I guess we're going to uncover what it really takes to not just, live longer, but
Yeah.
actually live those extra years in good health.
That's the goal. Like, what's the point of living longer if you're not feeling good, right? So let's start with this idea that it's all in your genes. We've all heard those stories, those families with a history of living to 100. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's definitely not as simple as, inheriting a long life gene, unfortunately.
Right, right.
Studies actually show that while our genes definitely play a role, the heritability of lifespan is only about 25%.
25%. Okay.
But here's the interesting part. This percentage, it jumps up a lot for people who reach, really exceptional ages, like those centenarians.
Oh, wow. So genes become even more important the longer someone lives. What does that mean for people who, have family members who've lived to be super old?
Well, research shows that if you have siblings who've made it to 100, you're actually significantly more likely to hit that milestone yourself compared to the average person. Longevity just seems to, run in families. They also tend to have lower rates of disease, which is interesting.
Huh. It's like they pass down some good health vibes or something.
Yeah, and their children seem to benefit too. It really highlights how much of an impact genetics has on aging.
Okay, so genes clearly matter, but what about our lifestyle choices? All that stuff we hear about diet, exercise, environment. Do those factors even matter if someone has a genetic predisposition for longevity?
That's where things get even more interesting. While genes definitely provide the groundwork, the foundation, our choices really build upon that. Research actually suggests that lifestyle might have an even greater impact on aging than genes alone.
Wow, really? So even if you didn't win the genetic lottery, you can still influence how you age through making healthy choices.
That's the idea. It's like this constant back and forth, this interplay between nature and nurture.
That's kind of empowering, right? Knowing you have some control over the process. I mean, how do those two forces actually work together, though? Genes and lifestyle, I mean.
Well, there's this fascinating area of research that focuses on what they call the buffering hypothesis.
Offering a hypothesis. Okay.
It suggests that some people have genes that actually, protect them from the negative effects of other genes.
Wait, hold on. Genes protecting against other genes. What does that even mean?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Think of it as having a genetic safety net.
Okay, I kind of get it. But do you have an example? How does that actually work?
Sure, a great example is this gene called APOE. It's a big player in longevity research.
APOE.
Okay, variations of this gene, specifically something called APOE4, are linked to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and heart disease. But some individuals with that APOE4 variant, they also have other genes that seem to, mitigate those risks.
Oh, interesting. So it's like they have a built-in bodyguard shielding them from those harmful effects. But if this APOE gene is so impactful, does that mean it's the only thing that determines longevity?
Not at all. While APOE is definitely significant, it's not the only gene involved. Scientists are actually finding lots of other genes that contribute to longevity. It's not a single gene, but more like a whole bunch of them working together. You're kind of like an orchestra.
Right, right. It's a team effort.
Exactly. Think of it as a genetic signature, unique to each individual.
So how are scientists figuring this all out? How do they even begin to untangle this whole genetic web? Can they actually identify which genes are the good guys and which ones are, the bad guys?
They're making incredible progress, actually. Scientists are developing something called a genetic signature for longevity based on tons of SNPs, which are tiny variations in our DNA sequence. These SNPs act kind of like a genetic fingerprint, offering insights into an individual's likelihood of living a longer life.
Wow, that's amazing. So we're moving toward a future where, personalized medicine could use this genetic info to really help people optimize their health and lifespan, right? But going back to that APOE gene for a second, you mentioned it's linked to Alzheimer's and heart disease. So does that mean it affects not just how long we live, but also how well we live, during those later years?
Absolutely. The APOE gene, and probably many others, influence not just lifespan, but also what we call health span, the quality of those later years.
So it's not just about reaching a certain age, but actually enjoying those years to the fullest, right?
Exactly. It's about living those extra years with vitality and well-being.
That's a good reminder. But remember, this whole intricate interplay of genes, it's just part of the story. Our lifestyle choices, they play a huge role in how those genes are expressed and ultimately how they influence our aging journey.
You got.
I'm really starting to see how much more there is to this whole aging thing. It's a lot more complex than I thought. Before we jump into those lifestyle factors, can you give me like a concrete example of this buffering effect? Something to help our listeners really picture how these genes interact.
Sure. The MTP gene is a good one. Some variations of this gene are linked to some not so great health outcomes. But, and this is the cool part, if someone with those variations also has certain variations of other genes, like this one called the CETP gene, it's almost like those other genes step in and say, nope, we're not going to let that happen. They basically counteract the negative effects.
So it's like a shield, right? That CETP gene, it's like a shield protecting against the potential harm from the MTP gene. It's mind-blowing, really. I'm starting to see just how intricate our genetic makeup really is.
It is incredibly complex. And that's what makes research on aging and longevity so fascinating. There's still so much we don't know.
I'm definitely hooked. Now I'm super curious to explore how those lifestyle factors fit into this puzzle. Like, what kind of an impact can our everyday choices really have on our aging process?
Well,
Okay, so we've talked about how genes can influence longevity and even how some genes can protect us from the effects of other genes. It's amazing. But now I'm really curious about the lifestyle side of things. Where does all that fit in?
oh, it's huge, really important. Think of it this way. While our genes give us a blueprint, it's our lifestyle choices that act like the architect, shaping how that blueprint actually comes to life.
So it's not like we're just, passive passengers in this whole aging process. We can actually make choices that, change how our genes actually work.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting, right? Research suggests that stuff like what we eat, how much we exercise, how we handle stress, even our social connections, all that can significantly impact how we age. It's about supporting healthy aging, like at the cellular level.
That makes a lot of sense, when you think about it. Our genes are constantly interacting with our environment, right? So it stands to reason that all those lifestyle choices would really matter. Is there, research that specifically looks at this gene-lifestyle connection?
Tons. One area that's really interesting is the research on telomeres.
Telomeres, okay.
Yeah, think of them as like protective caps on the ends of our DNA strands. Like imagine those little plastic tips on your shoelaces.
Yeah.
They keep the laces from fraying, right?
Right.
Telomeres are kind of like that for our DNA.
Okay, I can picture that. So how do these telomeres relate to aging?
Well, as we get older, our telomeres naturally shorten. It's a normal part of aging. But the thing is, shorter telomeres are linked to an increased risk of all those age-related diseases and just a general decline in health overall.
So basically, longer telomeres equal healthier aging. I'm going to guess those centenarians come into play here again. Do they have some secret for keeping their telomeres nice and long?
You're catching on. Studies have shown that centenarians and even their kids tend to have longer telomeres than the average person their age.
So there's got to be some genetic component to this, right?
There is. But here's what's super cool. Research also shows that lifestyle choices can affect telomere length too.
Hold on, really? You mean we can actually change how long our telomeres are by the things we do?
Yep. It's like we have a say in how fast our DNA ages.
What kind of lifestyle things are we talking about here?
Things like regular exercise, finding ways to manage stress, and, of course, eating a healthy diet.
So all that good stuff we already know is good for us, right?
Pretty much. It's like a win-win.
This is pretty amazing. It's not just about inheriting good genes, it's also about making choices that support those genes and help them do their best work.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to that whole fascinating connection between genes and lifestyle. It's not a one-way street, Our genes can actually influence our behaviors and what we like, but then the choices we make can actually impact how those genes are expressed. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. That reminds me of the stuff from the Physicians Committee, the source we have that focuses on those plant-based diets. Is there a connection between what we eat and telomere length?
There's actually growing evidence that there might be. Remember those blue zones we talked about earlier? Those areas where people live extra long lives?
Yeah.
Well, a lot of those places have something in common. They eat mostly plants.
Huh, interesting.
And some studies are actually showing that those kinds of diets, the ones with lots of fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes, might be linked to longer telomeres.
So all those foods that are already good for our heart and brain might also be protecting our DNA.
It's definitely possible. It all starts to fit together, doesn't it?
It does, it really does. And now you're going to tell me there's another layer to this whole thing, right?
There is. It's called epigenetics.
Epigenetics, okay. I've heard that word, but I'm not sure I really get it. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. Basically, think of epigenetics as a set of switches that can turn genes on or off.
Okay.
And the amazing part is that our environment and the choices we make can actually flip those switches, affecting how our genes actually work.
Wait, so you're telling me we're not just stuck with the genes we're born with? Our experiences can actually change how those genes function.
Exactly. It's pretty incredible, right? It means we have more control over our health and aging than we might realize.
This is like next level stuff.
Mm,
So it's kind of like our genes provide the sheet music, but our experiences and the choices we make determine how that music actually gets played.
I like that analogy. And what's even cooler is that researchers are starting to look at how epigenetics plays a role in longevity. They think that maybe centenarians might have inherited some specific epigenetic patterns that help them age more healthily.
So some people might be genetically predisposed to having those like epigenetic switches flipped in a way that supports a longer life.
It's definitely a possibility, and researchers are really digging into it. But the main takeaway here is that epigenetics adds a whole new dimension to how we understand aging. It's not just about the genes themselves, but how those genes are actually expressed throughout our lives, based on our environment and choices.
This is so much to wrap my head around, but it's fascinating. It's kind of empowering too, to realize how much potential control we have over our aging. But it's also incredibly complex. Like, how do we even start to make sense of all these interconnected pieces? Genes, lifestyle, now epigenetics. It's a lot.
I know, right? But that's the beauty of it. The more we learn about these interactions, the better choices we can make to support healthy aging.
So, where do we go from here? We've covered genes, lifestyle, telomeres, and epigenetics. Like, what are some key things our listeners can take away from all this and actually apply to their own lives?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that healthy aging is a process with a lot of different facets. It's not about finding one magic solution, but about embracing a more holistic approach, one that considers both our genes and the choices we make every day.
So, it's about working with our genes, not against them.
Exactly. We can't change the genes we're born with, but we can absolutely influence how they express themselves, through our habits and choices.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. Before we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything else you want to highlight for our listeners? Any final thoughts on everything we've talked about?
Okay.
Wow, we've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From those specific genes like APOE to how our lifestyle choices can impact things, and then that whole world of epigenetics. It's really given me like a whole new way of thinking about healthy aging.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Going through all this research really shows us that longevity isn't just about luck or chance, but this really complex interplay between our genes, our environment, and all those little choices we make each day.
I'm definitely walking away from this feeling a lot more empowered, knowing that aging isn't like this inevitable downhill slide. We can actually do something about it.
That's the amazing thing about science. It gives us that knowledge to take control of our health and well-being.
Before we wrap things up, what would you say is your biggest takeaway from all this research? What's the one thing you really hope our listeners remember?
Hmm. I think for me, it's that realization that even if we inherit some of those, disease risk genes, it doesn't mean we're destined for a certain outcome. We actually have a lot more power than we might think.
I love that. It's such a message of hope and possibility. We're not just victims of our genes. We can actually make choices that support healthy aging, no matter what our DNA says.
Exactly. And those choices, things like eating healthy foods, moving our bodies, managing stress, having good relationships, all of those things contribute to a longer, healthier life.
It's not just about living longer, it's about making those years count.
Right. Living with vitality and purpose.
Absolutely. And who knows what amazing discoveries are still to come. As scientists keep learning more about aging, we might discover even more secrets to living longer, healthier lives. It's exciting to think about. I can't wait to see what they find. This deep dive has really been eye-opening. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating journey exploring genes and aging.
It's been my pleasure. Just remember, everyone, aging's a journey, not a destination. Embrace it, make healthy choices, and keep those telomeres long.
Great advice. And to all our listeners, until next time, keep diving deep into the research and never stop learning. There's so much out there to discover.